Hey everyone, welcome back for the second episode of Beyond the Play. I'm Danny Barletta, along with Katherine Sheridan and Professor Doug Glanville. Professor Glanville, thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Always so much to talk about in the world of sports and society. So I'm always enjoying the conversation. So let's get to it.
Absolutely, yeah. So this week we're going to be talking about the NBA and the NFL and how each league has addressed the issue of social injustice in America and, kind of draw some comparisons. So to start off, I think the one constant we've seen between the two leagues and really all sports leagues when it comes to the protesting this year, and not even just this year, always, is it always starts with the players. And that's really been the case this year. It was the players who wanted to boycott some of the NBA playoff games in wake of Jacob Blake's shooting. It was the players who made the commercials and video messages supporting Black Lives Matter leading up to the NFL season. It's always the players who initiate these things. And I think when we're looking at the league's response, it kind of comes down to how well the league listens to its players and makes decisions based on what based on what they're standing for. So the first question I'd like to ask you, Professor Glanville, is to give a grade on an A to F scale on how the NBA and the NFL have handled the issue of racism in America and social injustice over the summer, and maybe the reason behind those grades.
Oh, I love it. Well, there's an aspect of it that's probably incomplete, but I think that's the tough part about having the patience to see how this plays out. Now, we do have the luxury of history. And I think going into Kaepernick, 2016, the NFL was flirting with an F-, if that's possible. So they were really struggling. And, but I do say that you're watching some of the decisions coming out, even the evolution of Commissioner Roger Goodell from 2016 to 2020. You saw someone recognizing, first of all, Kaepernick's contribution, which took a lot, Black Lives Matter, just sort of addressing it. And what I like is the initiatives that have come out of it that have been set up to be collaborative. So I think from there, I think they've moved to more of like a C area, C+. They're kind of starting to think about concretely how to make change, because there's a lot of performance out there, performatively. You can do symbolism, and that has a certain resonance and importance to any movement. But getting into the nitty gritty, that's sometimes where you don't get the sort of, the global view of it, because people are like, well, that's not that exciting compared to doing symbolic gestures, but that's actually what will sustain. So I'd say the NFL is in the right direction, and we just have to see how much they're going to sustain it. They have that social initiative, that partnership. They have a lot of programs, and their websites now, NFL Ops, their operations page, they have great stuff, great content about inspiring change. So now I want to see the policy side. So that's the NFL. Now, am I supposed to grade the NBA too?
Yes.
So NBA, definitely a better grade, maybe like an A-. They, if you look at, I often look back and their history with respect to players and the players union. And I also would make the point that it always has to start with the players in these environments. The leagues often, from the business sensibilities, are going to do what is profitable. They're going to do what's safe to maintain audiences. They're not thinking directly in that lens, and the players need to be that driver. The NBA union started with a player, right? Bob Cousy really was the pioneering force. And I noticed even historically, a lot of their change happened when they threatened to not play games, very similar to 2020. All-Star game, 1964, 1962. I mean, there was boycotting and then getting pensions out of it and these last-second negotiations. So the players have that kind of power. And the NBA, because they're different, they just have different constructs. The NFL has the shield, right? It's much more about this presentation of, okay, we're protecting something. The players are more anonymous in this warrior culture. I think the political map of the NFL is different because they really are the United States completely. They have so much viewership. Where the NBA is sort of like, you know what? We just lean this way, left progressively. That's who we are. And we're okay. We recognize some people are not going to like us. So they're different histories, and NBA is so much more player driven because these players are really enterprises. They're really enterprises. They're not like baseball. Even baseball has trouble with your anonymity. And the NFL literally is anonymous in these helmets. So you have much more force behind you as an individual player. And then collectively, they have a lot of power.
So I would say, as we're sticking with that theme of players initiative, like you just said, but also shifting gears a little bit in the sense that looking at media and using different platforms to get certain messages across. Recently we did see, and we touched on it before, but these NFL players coming together, organizing a message that is essentially calling out their own commissioner to do better and condemn the social unrest that's not only happening in the nation, but that's really taking down their, or taking over their league. So I would say that I have a two-part question, which would mean, like, the first one being, how effective is the video, in the sense that just the platform that these players used, and then second and more powerful would be why is it that it's these players that are coming and kind of surpassing or doing the job of these leaders in the NFL?
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that that player history, I think that connects the dots to explain even how they present themselves through the media, like how the media interprets it. And when you have these icons in the NBA, right, really truly come to the league in this iconic fashion. There's only 12 players on a team. You create this environment where, when you are a walking enterprise and you have social media followings and you have this huge footprint beyond the game. I mean, there are endorsement deals. It just keeps going. You're just going to have a different construct around how the media really celebrates you, identifies you, and the directness of your messaging. And so when you talk about maybe the symbolic components to it, go back to the paper I always assign in my class. You compare Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson through a letter that King wrote Robinson. And Robinson actually criticized King for not stepping in because the SCLC and the NAACP were having kind of beef. Well, that beef was based on the SCLC really being forward facing, right? They were out there marching streets, protesting in the churches, right? They were doing that kind of work. And started to be perceived as more, like you said, symbolic and gesture. Well, the NAACP was back in the courtrooms, right, doing that slow work. But you need both. You need both. And the NBA, I feel, has mastered that fairly well, right? They can do the performance, right? Kneel, Black Lives Matter sign on the court, literally. And they also are kind of working more now about getting out the vote and the ways that they work. And that's really, quite a tandem. And the NFL is not there, and they're just constructed differently. And you think about players in the NFL, you're kind of a fungible asset more than any sport. You get hurt, you're gone, you get released. I mean, so I think the NFL kind of calculated, like, well, all right, this guy's upset, but he's going to be out of the league in a year or two, so who cares? It's not as important. But then they found that there was a connectivity that started to form really through Kaepernick, I think, was a key thing. Their union history is interesting too, because their free agency, they went to court for free agency, 1987, and the courts came out 2 years later, kind of winking and nodding like, you better do something about this. And so they created this thing called Plan B in '89. But there was a 4-year period where they had no union, they had no players association, because if you are a union, the league can then then be exempt from antitrust. Right, so they could monopolize. So they said, all right, we'll dissolve and then maybe form a players association. But there was like a 4-year period, they had no representation. So you can imagine what that does to your legacy when you had a period of time where you basically didn't have that coalition. So that's a very different history, right? So I think a lot of that informs how, from a media, like you said, outward facing standpoint, these leagues will be received. And the NFL just has such a wide base. They're so afraid of stepping on any political landmine because they're really everywhere, because they are everywhere.
Just to speak to the player empowerment more, I mean, I've seen that as we go on. It sounds like the NBA just has that ability, or has created that atmosphere where players aren't afraid to come forward and essentially aren't afraid to lose their livelihood, because they're not going to, because of that stronger connection Adam Silver has built. Like, I think it comes down to just being genuine and kind of taking a step back and realizing that these are humans, not just players in entertainment. whereas the NFL right now, they're struggling to find that player strength and just understanding that it's the players that will essentially determine how the game goes on and off the field. It will also be interesting, especially with the NBA season nearing around the corner. I think preseason starts tonight. And then also as we make that NFL playoff push to see how these leagues continue to deal with the social unrest in America and their leagues. But that's all we have for this week's episode of Beyond the Play. Professor Glanville, thank you so much for giving your time to us. It's always a great conversation. And on behalf of everybody from UCTV, our viewers at home, and to you and your family, we wish you a healthy and safe holiday season and to a brighter 2021.
Thanks, Katherine. Thanks, Danny. Always a pleasure.
Awesome.